Hi there, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight as part of our Books in Common reading series. I'd like to thank our partner stores. I always forget to start with myself. I'm James Crossley. I'm the manager of Madison Books in Seattle. And the partner stores that I was referring to are Country Bookshelf in Bozeman, Montana, and Paulina Springs Books in Sisters, Oregon, who have joined forces with us to present this author reading series. A couple things about the space. By now, everyone's probably used to Zoom calls like this, but just in case you're new to it, if you have any technical difficulties, usually those are resolved by just leaving and rejoining the webinar. Any audio problems often are resolved just by the use of headphones. That tends to eliminate feedback and echoing that sometimes occurs for people, not always, and hopefully not tonight. We also want to mention that this is a shared creative space and we want it to remain safe for everyone. So we will be monitoring the chat for any kinds of offensive comments or questions, and the commenters will be removed from the space. Tonight, we're joined by a couple of folks. I will introduce them both now, starting with author Lonnie Lusardo. Lonnie is the founder of the Diversity Collaborative, a veteran-owned diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting firm. He's worked with government agencies and Fortune 500 companies in this capacity since 1991. He was a reporter, a newspaper reporter, and a freelance correspondent before that for many years, and he holds degrees in journalism and education from Boston University and Seattle University. And in conversation with Lonnie tonight will be Dr. William Parkin, who is an associate professor in the Department of Criminal Justice at Seattle University, who researches domestic extremism and terrorism, violent victimization, the media's social construction of criminal justice issues, and community safety and security. Will received his doctorate in criminal justice from the City University of New York and John Jay College of Criminal Justice. And he also holds degrees from Arizona State University and James Madison University. I'm really glad to have them both here tonight to talk about what, even since we first booked this event, has become an increasingly relevant topic. And I'm going to step away for a little bit to let these two talk, and I'll come back later to share questions from you. Oh, I should mention, of course, if you have questions, and we know you will, enter them in the Q&A box, the little balloons at the bottom of your screen, and I will make sure that those get shared with our conversationalists tonight. So without further ado, take it away, gentlemen.
Thank you, James. And I think I'll start by just asking Lonnie a question that I think is really important when we start reading material by individuals who are doing research on this topic, and that's, where did the motivation come and what inspired you to write this book and to do the research on this book?
Thank you, Will. The inspiration came from I was profiled in a book that was published in 2001 titled White Men Challenging Racism. And it was stories at 35 profiles of white men working to fight racism. And after the book came out, I talked to there were 3 authors, and I talked to the authors about, it's so interesting that most of the other people featured in the book did not come from a background like mine. I was raised in a very racist environment. I called myself a recovering racist. Most of the people in the book, White Men Challenging Racism, were born into families fighting racism. So I talked to the authors and I said, I'd be fascinated to know if you know any extremists who have made a change from their extreme ways to be more inclusive. And the authors referred me to Southern Poverty Law Center. And before I knew it, I had tons of people to talk to. I interviewed dozens and chose the 6 that I profile in my book because they're so interesting for not only the stories of how they got into the movement, what they did while they were members of the hate group, but more importantly, how they got out. And that was what I wanted to tell in the book. Thank you.
So it took you over a decade to do your research and to work on the book. That's correct, right?
That is correct.
So that's a long period of time to invest yourself into a project. So obviously it's extremely important to you. And so when people pick up this book, what are the main takeaways that you want them to get out of the book? You know, what are the points that you think are most important for them?
I'm really glad you asked that. Yeah, there are really 2 overarching points that I try to make in the book. The book is written in 2 parts. Part 1 is about people. It is stories of former white supremacists. And the second part is an analysis, if you will, of how the hate movement operates, how government agencies monitor the movement, how nonprofits like Southern Poverty Law Center and Anti-Defamation League track hate groups. So the 2 overarching points are, 1, what most Americans know about hate crimes and hate groups is misleading, grossly incomplete, and dead wrong. The second point, and these are all things that I never could have imagined before I did the research. The second point is the father of all hate groups is the US government. And that is because of presidential orders, acts of Congress, and US Supreme Court decisions going back to the founding of the country that were designed to limit or eliminate the rights of citizens based on their cultural backgrounds. And that goes on up until today. So it was a hard lesson for me to learn that, particularly because as a veteran, I was very committed to being in the US Navy and doing whatever I had to do to protect my country. But now I have different thoughts about it. I'm not in any way a militia person or trashing the government, not at all. I just have a different understanding of what the government stands for today.
You know, one of the things, thinking about how prevalent the discussion in the media right now is about the far right and hate groups and hate ideology. Could you talk a little bit about how you've seen over the 13 years that you've been doing the research, shifts that you've seen or changes that you've seen that you think are important, and how the white supremacist ideology or the hate ideology has manifested itself?
Yeah, write that question down because I would love to hear your answer to that question as well. What I never could have imagined at the start is the evolution of the hate movement. We are hearing about hate groups today that I had never heard of when I started writing the book, even as recently as last year. And the best example is the Wolverine Watchmen. They're a militia group that had plotted to take down the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, and the same suspects are accused of a plot to kidnap the governor of Virginia as well, Ralph Northam, and they're both Democrats. One of the things that goes along with that question that I never could have anticipated is hearing from the intelligence directors at both the Southern Poverty Law Center and ADL, Anti-Defamation League, who both said to me, today hate groups are irrelevant. And I said, what do you mean irrelevant? And what causes them to say that is based on the research they do, somewhere between 3% and 5%. Some different investigators will say up to 10%, but a small percentage of hate crimes are actually committed by members of hate groups. That is a change that we're seeing in huge numbers today, where the vast majority of hate crimes are committed by loner extremists, no connection to a hate group, who are out and about, see something, a person or a monument or a church or a mosque or a synagogue that rubs them the wrong way, and they act in a violent way. So that's the growing, changing nature of the hate groups is really what makes it so spooky. And finally, today, so many groups communicate by social media. So they're really underground. They are not on the surface. They are not visible. We don't see flags waving. We don't see swastikas on people by way of tattoos. These folks could be your next door neighbor. And I'd be interested in hearing the same assessment from your point of view.
So yeah, definitely. I started researching far-right extremism back in 2007, and the research I did for my dissertation focuses specifically on homicide victimization, so individuals who are killed by far-right extremists. And so it's a smaller piece of the puzzle than hate group or bias homicides, but looking at the ideologies and how it's changed over the last 13 years that I've been working on this. I think I told you, Lonnie, I've had 2 kids with my partner in the last 5 years, and I kind of got out of doing as much research as I had wanted to do. And within the last 6 months, I all right, I gotta get back into this and pay a lot more attention. And it just blew my mind how many new groups are out there. And so looking at these groups, obviously the alt-right has been around for a while. The Proud Boys have been around for a while, over the last several years. QAnon, which we would group into the far-right extremism. A lot of the ways that these groups manifest themselves is different. The names of the groups are different, like the Boogaloo Boys, but the underlying ideology and the underlying conspiracies and the underlying hate, I think you can trace that pretty clearly back, decades through the far right movement. And so even though things seem different, and I think in some ways they are different, I definitely think people from these ideologies feel more empowered now and feel that it's more mainstream to talk about these and gather and be parts of these groups. The underlying ideology, though, seems to be the same. Even with QAnon, the conspiracy theories that are coming out of this are conspiracy theories that you could see from the last 50, 60 or more years from the far right. So it's an interesting thing, at least from my perspective. The groups are new, how they're manifesting themselves or identifying themselves as new, so it's important to pay attention to that. But a lot of the underlying hate that's coming from them is the same. So those are kind of my observations of what's going on.
Something that I'd like us both to talk about, when I referred earlier to one of the main concepts in the book, that what most Americans know about hate groups and hate crimes is misleading, incomplete, or dead wrong. Part of that is based on the data that we get from government agencies, notably the FBI and BJS, the Bureau of Justice Statistics. And what so many people are unaware of, I certainly was not aware of it before I started reading the book, is that both of those agencies, FBI and BJS, track the number of hate groups or hate crimes committed every year. And they break them down on the basis of the demographics of both the victims and the offenders. But what makes those data questionable, not questionable, just totally messed up, is one, we know from Bureau of Justice Statistics that 54% of hate crimes are never reported to police. So if more than half of the hate crimes are never reported, the data reporting hate crimes is probably 50% out of whack. And the second frustrating point from FBI is the FBI gets its hate crimes data from 17,000 police jurisdictions, law enforcement agencies across the US, but only between 12 and 15% of those 17,000 agencies bother to send annual data to the FBI. So the FBI is giving very misleading and very incomplete information. Something I learned very strongly from you when I did my first interview with you was the distinctions between the ways FBI capture data and BJS. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. So the data you're referring to from the Bureau of Justice Statistics is from the National Crime Victimization Survey. And it's a household level survey that they collect data on and put out data yearly. And it's trying to estimate criminal victimization across the United States. And so it doesn't rely on official data. It relies on talking to people in the household and making sure that in the way that they're wording the questions, they're actually finding out whether people experience victimization. And then with the bias or the hate crime data that the NCVS puts out, they also will ask questions about whether or not there's any what they call bias indicators that have occurred during a crime that would make the victim believe that they were targeted for something such as their racial identity, ethnic identity, sexual orientation, and so on. And so victimization data does a better job at us understanding crime victimization across the country. And that's because it doesn't rely on official data. And as you pointed out, there's a large number of victimizations that occur that nobody ever picks up the phone to call law enforcement for many, many reasons, which will vary across jurisdictions. And then, so we would have more confidence in the NCVS data, the victimization data. The other thing is the FBI data, the supplement is the Uniform Crime Report. And with that, that does rely on official reporting by law enforcement. So only crimes that someone calls and law enforcement shows up and believes that a crime occurs and fills out a report, will those show up in the UCR. And the FBI doesn't have a mechanism to force departments to turn in this data. So what happens is there are jurisdictions that just don't turn the data. There's a history of certain states not turning in the data or not turning the data in the proper format, so it never makes it into the national estimates. And then with bias crime specifically, you have the issue where in order for the FBI to count it in the UCR as a hate crime, the police department has to identify it as a hate crime. And so that's not always going to happen. The police department might decide that it doesn't fit the definition, while in the MCVS, the victim might say, well, yes, this occurred. And, this indicator happened, someone used a racial slur while they were attacking me. And so it should be a bias crime. And so, and I think we had talked about the numbers, the huge discrepancy in the numbers. In 2015, there was a little over 7,000 bias crimes reported to the FBI. And in the NCVS, the estimate was that there was over 200,000 bias crimes that had occurred.
NCVS, say what it is again, please.
So the UCR, which is the official data, the FBI data that came in, they said there's about 7,000 bias crime victims, and there was over 200,000 that the NCVS reported for that year. So even if you want to say, well, half of that was never reported to police, that still should have been about 100,000.
And NCVS is National Crime Victimization Survey, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
There's another dimension to the ambiguity of this stuff, and that is how states define who can be the victim of a hate crime. Something that I was shocked to find out is the number of states that differ. For example, there are now 4 states. There were 5 states until last year, 4 states currently that have no hate crimes law at all. If a citizen of those states is the victim of a bias crime, that crime will be prosecuted as another offense that will have a less severe sentence to it, an assault or another crime, but not a hate crime. I was also fascinated to learn that 19 states do not protect on the basis of disabilities in their states. 19 states do not protect people with disabilities in their hate crimes law. 15 states do not include sexual orientation or gender identity in their hate crimes laws. 18 states include both, yay for them. And only 3 states in the US, Florida, Maine, and Maryland, and District of Columbia, include homelessness as a protected category. And homelessness, based on many of the people I interviewed, homeless people were a huge target for them. And also, I wanted to add identify the 4 states with no hate crimes laws. They're Arkansas, Indiana, South Carolina, and Wyoming. Georgia was on that, didn't have a hate crimes law until last year. So we're making some progress. We are making some progress. Anything you can add to the ambiguity of who's protected by hate crimes laws and how they are defended?
Yeah, so I think, one of the things I wanted to talk about is, the targeting of individuals based on race or, gender identity, sexual orientation, their home status. And in the research that I do with the far right homicide victims, we see all of those individuals unfortunately represented as the victims. During the 90s, and I'm sure it's even prevalent today, but skinheads or neo-Nazi groups were very notorious for going out and looking for homeless individuals, drug addicts, and specifically targeting them. Who's protected by each state statute. I think a lot of that has to do with the cultural norms of the states and the jurisdictions. And so I think that's, if you look at who protects who, I think that's probably a reflection of the norms in those communities, unfortunately. And so there are some communities that just have decided not to protect individuals who have been historically targeted for violence against them. And in addition to state, you also have municipal. So there might be jurisdictions within states, like cities or counties, that have decided to pass at the misdemeanor level, so at a lower level of offense, some type of protection or some type of statute that will increase the penalty. So there is that other level, and then the federal government has one too. So the federal government could also come in and prosecute under the federal hate crime statute.
And the federal hate crime statute, named after Matthew Shepard and James Byrd, two victims of very violent hate crimes in the late 90s, I think 98, somewhere around there. The federal hate crimes law is very inclusive, and Washington state hate crimes law is based on the federal law. So it too is very inclusive. I don't know about the hate crimes laws in Montana or Oregon. I believe Oregon's hate crime law is similar to Washington state's. Montana, I don't know. So that too folds into the ambiguity of all this stuff. It's so hard for news consumers to really understand what's happening with hate groups. And what I never realized is if someone is Christian, white, born in the US, straight, able-bodied, and has a roof over their head, they have no reason to know about hate crimes. They have no reason to know it. Today, I think that statement is no longer true because hate groups affect entire communities. It affects the economy. It affects the way people live in cities or choose to leave cities. And that dynamic is something I never could have imagined before doing this work. Certainly in my years doing cultural diversity training and inclusion training, I was able to see differences from state to state, but how that plays out at an extreme level is very spooky. And I think more people need to know about it.
Yeah, Lonnie, that actually, it reminds me of something I wanted to ask you, because you've done, in addition to the book, even before the book was published, you've done a lot of work with groups talking about this. And so one of the things that you've come away with is this idea that people just really don't know. They don't know about the prevalence of the crimes or the number of groups or things like that. Could you talk a little bit about, because you say people aren't informed about it, what is the perception that people have when you ask them about this phenomena and what's going on in the world?
Great question. Most people, when I was doing courses or workshops, most of the people who come to a course or a workshop will have an awareness of what hate groups are. Post-publication, the audiences I talk to really are just interested to know more. So when I do public presentations, I always start with a quiz where I ask a couple questions. And the first question is, do you know how many hate groups there are in your state? And this is mind-boggling. I've talked to thousands of people over the past, while I was doing the research and now after the book is out, no one No one has ever answered that question accurately. So if anybody is interested, Washington State has 30 hate groups, and they are all different kinds of groups targeting different constituencies, anything from African Americans to immigrants, Muslims, LGBTQ plus folks, etc. Another question I like to ask is, what do you know about the number of hate groups in the US? And folks will have no idea. And based on data from the Southern Poverty Law Center and their hate map, we know that as of February of 2020, there are 1,020 hate groups identified nationwide. What we don't know is the number changes every year. So previously, in 2019, there were 940 groups. So between last year and this year, we lost something like, I think it's 80 hate groups. Well, those folks who leave a hate group don't suddenly find Jesus or find anybody and become enlightened and compassionate. No, they're still hateful people, and each one of them is a time bomb in the form of a lone extremist. So they're the kinds of things that we're discovering. In terms of Oregon and Montana, Oregon has 15 hate groups, half the number as Washington, and Montana has 6. I would have expected more in Montana and Idaho. Idaho has 7 hate groups. But here in a state that's a bastion of liberalism, identified as a blue state, we have 30 very active hate groups.
Yeah, and I think that brings up a good point about the data from the SPLC. I mean, they do a fantastic job tracking it, but one of the limitations, because of the nature of this, is that you don't know how many people are part of these groups. So you could have 30 in Washington State, and there could be 10 people associated with those groups, and you could have 7 in Montana, and there could be 200 people associated with each of those groups. And that's just the nature of these organizations, where most are not publicizing, although there have been times that they've found groups like the KKK. They've actually found, their list of people who have signed up for their email or their mail distribution stuff. But we don't know what the prevalence is. And you referenced social media, and these discussions have now moved online. And when they move into private sectors, or even not private discussions, there could be 1,000 people that are friends or part of a group, and you just don't know how many of those people are ideologically committed, or are friends of people who are ideologically committed, or are thinking about committing a violent act based on the ideology. And that's the difficult part, is determining not only who becomes ideologically radicalized, but then who takes the next step. And that's very difficult to figure out.
I was fascinated to learn from the intelligence director at Southern Poverty Law Center that the number of people in hate groups is incalculable. We really have nothing more than an educated guess. We know the number of groups, and group is kind of squishy because so many groups today are online only and communicate by social media, so they're not an identifiable group. per se. So in contrast with the number of organizations, what a man from Southern Poverty Law Center said to me is, if I go to the leader of one of these groups and say, how many members do you have? That leader is going to say, we have 500 members, when in fact they have 2. So, you know, all of these data are just mushy, just plain mushy. Something I want to fold in some way to this conversation, how people get into hate groups. When I was interviewing Brian Widener, one of the 5 I profile in my book, he, very interesting man, one of the more violent. In the context of the interview, he went totally off track with what I was asking and said the most profound statement to me. He said, you want to know how we recruit people? It's very easy. You go to a place where people congregate, could be a bar, it could be a concert, and you look for the guy who's detached, who's sitting alone, and you just chat him up and find out what pisses him off. And then what Brian said is, you just tell him, man, I know, and you know, it's not you. You know, what really pisses me off is these groups that are taking over our country. We have this group taking jobs, and this group violating our morals, and this group doing X, and this, and hey, why don't you come over and have a beer with my buddies? And most of the people who are attracted, who become attracted to hate groups, tend to be loners, tend to be detached from family, peers. And when they find themselves in a like-minded group, even if that group has a philosophy that violates their core values, they create this sense of belonging that cements them together. And trying to leave that when they decide for some reason, I can't handle this anymore, I have to get out, then they are subjected to violence against them and their families. Is this what, I see you nodding, so you are agreeing with this, right?
Oh yeah. I mean, that's definitely a major mechanism that people will join the group and be part of the group for, you know, the social component of it, and feeling like they belong to something. And a lot of times the ideological radicalism, not for everyone, but a lot of times the ideological radicalization comes after. You know, they don't join the group because they have, like you're saying, because they have the shared ideology. They join the group for the friendship, and then the ideology comes after that. And actually, you know, since you're talking about the people that you interviewed, one of the things that popped into my mind was the individuals that you interviewed kind of moved out of the movement probably a decade or more ago,
yeah.
If I remember correctly. What do you see about them and kind of their journey, and how that compares to what we're seeing today with people who are part of, you know, the far right movement today? And is there, I guess maybe also what I'm getting to, is there hope for de-radicalizing and pulling people out of the movement that have been radicalized recently?
Yeah, I think there is hope. It is truly fascinating to see the divisions in our country today. We live in a government, the leader of which emboldens hate groups. Without getting too political, and it's impossible to talk about this field without getting political, there has been an encouragement from the highest office in the nation that is promoting this social consciousness, the zeitgeist, that empowers extremists, white supremacists, specifically to continue what they do rather than condemning them. So there is a likelihood that that is going to continue. We also have a growth of anti-fascist groups or Antifa. Antifa is not really a group, it's more of a movement, an ideology that balances out the radical right with a very leftist point of view. So we would hope that the two ideologies could be balanced, but we're not seeing that balance. What I'm very fearful of, going along with your question, is what will happen on November 4th when the results start to come in about the election. Will we see violent pushback from the right or the left? Depending, it doesn't matter who wins. The country is so divided that we are likely to see a pushback. And we have the model for it going back to the killing of George Floyd and what we've seen in streets and at police stations across the country since then. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, so thinking about kind of the juxtaposition of, the far right and the far left, at least in the work that I do with deadly violence, there really is no comparison on the far left. Even putting or pulling in, Animal Liberation Front or Environmental Liberation Front, or the Earth Liberation Front, sorry. Those groups were very specific, at least with criminal activity, to make sure that nobody was injured. So at the level that I'm looking at, which is fatal violence, there's not much of a comparison. There are some cases of left-wing individuals who appear to engage in ideological violence, but it just, compared to the number that we've seen in the data that we collect, it's not even close. And so, yeah, it's interesting. And now, I mean, there has been a history of far left violence in the United States, but I mean, we're talking decades and decades ago, the 60s and 70s. And really, when the far right was active in the 80s going forward, there really aren't many comparisons to that level of violence. Now, if you want to get down to other things like arson or property damage, there might be more equivalent types of criminal behavior. But yeah, as far as that, it's, in the data that we look at, it's not a comparison. So
we are getting to a time where we may want to find out questions. I think James is around somewhere. There you are.
Yeah, I was listening in, and I was actually, I was poised with one relating to what you were talking about just there. I mean, for the beginning of the book, let me actually find the quote because it's so provocative. The father of all hate groups is the United States government. And this relates to what you were just talking about. So I was hoping you could expand on that, both of you, I guess. I mean, we've seen that this summer, clearer connections between police departments coordinating with more or less organized militia groups, police officers who seem to be members of those groups, judging by tattoos and insignias and things like that. So that very provocative statement, could you talk about more about what you meant by that? And is this really a factor? Does this have to do with the recent political developments, or you're talking about historically?
Historically and currently. So going back to Well, we can think of many ways the federal government has responded to marginalized populations. Let's just look at the Native American population for a few minutes. Government response to natives was, we want your land and we know how to get it. We're going to kill you. So as a result, there was this mass homicide, genocide of Native Americans. Then we have presidential orders, the biggest of which was when FDR signed made a presidential order to intern all Japanese Americans on the West Coast. I didn't even know that the West Coast states were doing that. I grew up in Connecticut. I didn't learn that until I moved to Seattle in '79, and I was shocked to hear that. So we have presidential orders, and consider under the Trump administration, one of the very first acts that Trump instituted was a presidential order banning residents of primarily Muslim nations from entering the US. Many of those orders are, it's no surprise, targeting marginalized populations, the same groups being targeted by hate groups today. When we look at congressional acts, and I have a whole chapter in my book of various acts passed by Congress, if you consider an act like the Chinese, help me with the law, Will, the Chinese Exclusion Act. Well, the Chinese Exclusion Act, late 80s, early 90s, was a whole effort to limit the rights of Chinese Americans, or to limit the number of Chinese coming into the country. So we have laws, and then we have Supreme Court actions that over the years have taken rights away from groups. I'm a gay man myself, and I've seen that happen against LGBT groups in my lifetime. I'm 73 years old. It's like the laws go up and down, up and down. You have some positive laws, and then some laws take your rights away. And that's been happening with all groups that are currently protected by the Federal Hate Crimes Prevention Act. Will, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so a couple of things I wanted to talk about. You know, since you're referencing the Hate Crime Act now, I think it's important to just reflect on how recently that was passed. And so it took till 2009 for the federal government to pass legislation that specifically said that although there were mechanisms before that through, you know, violations of individual civil rights, but really it took till 2009 till the government could pass a law that specifically identified bias and hate crimes, and a mechanism for enforcing that, which I think is something important to reflect on. You know, the other thing, James, you kind of said, you know, is this a current thing, or is it a historical thing? And I think one of the things that we've seen over the last 6 months is that people in society are now being more willing to acknowledge the systemic racism and how laws are passed, what laws are enforcing or not enforcing, how law enforcement then engages with the public based on these laws. And so I think that, you know, to Lonnie's point, and I see this as a hopeful thing, that people are now willing across the country to say that, yes, there is an equity issue here, there is a disparity issue here, and a lot of it is based on how our systems are set up, not just criminal justice, but health, education. And so yeah, I think it's a historical thing that now people are really willing to start saying, yes, this is a problem that needs to be addressed. And once again, it's unfortunate that it takes so long, but.
One more thing I'd like to add to that, James, and that's the incarceration rates. Going back to the 70s, early 70s, late 60s, up till today, the incarceration rates have skyrocketed in the number of people convicted and imprisoned, and that rise was based on laws passed by law and order presidents, where the law and the order came down on particularly drug-using people, and that mostly protected, or that mostly victimized Black and brown people who ended up not only getting busted, but they couldn't afford a lawyer, they couldn't afford the price to bail them out, so they get time in the slammer. And now we have this proliferation of private prisons, and we have to pay for that. And the government, our taxes are paying to house people who never should have been arrested in the first place. I could explain a lot more.
As soon as you start talking about these things, you see how many other issues are connected to the same thing.
Yeah.
One thing you mentioned hope, and I did want to mention something. I should bring up the book here. It's called An Anatomy of Organized Hate, and we've been talking about a lot of fairly depressing things. And one thing you did mention a little bit, but we didn't emphasize, is that a big part of this book is conversations with people who have come out of this ideology and how they did that. And so there is a lot of redemption, and there is a lot of possibility to it. And bringing up the book here is a good chance for me to remind everybody out there, you can and should purchase An Anatomy of Organized Hate from one of the participating bookstores. There's a link in the chat which will take you to a site where you can just choose whichever bookstore you like and buy the book there, because it is fascinating. Another question we have that we can share here, and when this sort of relates to me, when I moved to the region, I think the Northwest was considered a hotbed of this kind of racial hatred, at least by reputation. You know, the idea of militias holed up in the woods of Idaho and Washington and so forth. Was that the case then? Is that the case still now?
So what you're describing is an expectation that hate groups would be in the country, in more rural areas. That was your expectation?
I think that was what I had learned from the media. Was these, people holed up with apocalyptic visions and weapons, and that this is where the center of that movement was.
Yeah, well, that's true, and those groups could be right next door to you. What I learned from the neo-Nazi group, the neo-Nazi organizers that I talked to, is they lived in major cities and they proudly displayed Nazi flags on their homes, and they were in the center of big cities in the US, all in the US. So they could be anywhere. They could be right next door to you, and you, in many cases, would have no idea. Today, you are much less likely to know who these folks are because they are so underground and communicating through social networks and different ways of communicating, but they're still as hateful and they are there. Well, would you agree with that? Well,
yeah, I was thinking back to, once again, I pull a lot of stuff back to the research I do with the murder data. And I think what we definitely see in our data is that first of all, the Pacific Northwest, yes, there seems to be a disproportionate amount of these cases in the Pacific Northwest compared to other areas of the country. We don't have a lot in the center of the country, and it's the Northeast, the South, and the West. In the Midwest, there's just not much. And I think part of it is probably this mix of people from different backgrounds being in one place. And the other thing with the Pacific Northwest specifically, and I don't know if I'm right about this because this is just me kind of thinking it through, I think having, more of a, whether people identify as conservative or liberal, there's still kind of like this libertarian perspective, especially outside of the I-5 corridor, where people just kind of want to be left alone and do their own thing. And I think a lot of that, especially with the far right, is extremely appealing. Both segments of the far right, anti-government extremists and white supremacists. And so, yeah, it still happens all over the country, but yeah, I do think it seems like it happens a lot in the Pacific Northwest and California, a lot in California too.
I can't hold back this story. I was the victim of a violent hate crime in 1980, which I did not report to police. In itself, that's no big deal. I'm a gay man. I've been subjected to abuse my entire life, going back to high school. What is unusual is where that hate crime happened. In Key West, Florida. Key West, at that particular year, 1980, had a huge LGBTQ population on the island. That was part of the reason I went there. What happened was I walked out of a gay bar with a fellow Navy buddy from my Navy days. And as soon as we walked out the door, a car was driving by. And the men in the car, there were 4 men, started throwing beer bottles. My friend got out, he ran, and I didn't know what to do. And these guys throw bottles. I started running. They chased after me, cut me off, and beat the bejesus out of me on a one-way street in Key West, Florida. And this happened on the street where it happened was the main street in Key West. So the reason I'm telling that is we have no idea where hate crimes are going to happen.
That was the perfect segue to the next question that we had, which had to do with whether or not you had personal experiences that brought you to these lines of work. And Lonnie, I don't know if that specific experience was something that drew you into this. I mean, feel free to please talk more about that. And Will, the same kind of question to you, like how you pursued this line of research.
Yeah. Well, I've been doing, as you introduced me, I've been doing diversity and inclusion and equity work for 30 years. And through most of those years, I've introduced myself as a recovering racist. I was raised in a household where the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was the Antichrist. And people, whenever I say that, people will say, well, that's awful. Where were you raised? I was raised in the United States of America. And at the same time as my family was putting down Martin Luther King, the director of the FBI was referring, J. Edgar Hoover, was referring to Martin Luther King as a public enemy. That is when he wasn't prancing around in chiffon, which we've heard of since, and all of his contradictory proclivities. But the purpose of this is I learned from my own environment how to hate people of color, how to hate anybody in a marginalized population. And the factor that got me to become more compassionate is realizing in high school that I'm a gay man and I had nobody to tell. I couldn't tell my family in 1964 when I graduated high school. I couldn't tell my friends. And I started to befriend more and more people in other marginalized groups until I realized I can't put those people down anymore. I'm one of them. So everything changed for me at that point. How about you, Will?
Yeah, so, one of the first memory I have of kind of understanding what goes on in the world related to far-right extremism is standing in my family room in 1995, watching on TV the remnants of the Alfred P. Murrah building after Timothy McVeigh blew it up. And that had a really big impact on me. And it was one of the things then throughout my educational career, then I kept going back to trying to understand and think about how someone middle class white male like myself ends up doing that. And so to me, it was trying to figure that out, not necessarily from the psychology perspective, but just kind of understanding how people from what we would say are not affluent backgrounds, because obviously individuals in the far right movement come from many different backgrounds, some very impoverished, some uneducated, and just kind of thinking about how you get to that point where you're willing to commit violence, when in reality, you've probably had a leg up more than a lot of people in society, but something in you've internalized, either it's a victimhood status or blaming things that haven't gone well in your life on others, and how you get to that point then where not only do you become ideologically radicalized, but you're willing to go murder people for it. So.
Any other questions, James?
I think we're close to our time here, so we'll probably use that. I love that we can end on a moment of personal experience there, because it reminds us how these big political issues are actually relatable and relevant to each of us as individuals. So.
How to end on a high note. Let me say this. There is great hope. If people like the people I interviewed can leave hate groups, extremists, can become compassionate and empathetic, anybody can. It only takes one incident. What the cultural anthropologist Morris Massey calls significant emotional experiences. And what happened in the lives of almost everyone I interviewed was what caused them to change, or one of the very big significant emotional events that caused them to get out of the movement, was gaining a very meaningful relationship with someone in the target group they had previously hated. And they began to realize this person is just like me. And, I can't remember if I referred to this earlier, but one of the greatest quotes Martin Luther King ever voiced is, "Love is the only force capable of transforming an enemy into a friend." And that's what happened with these folks. And the bottom line is, we all have to get out more. We just have to get out more, meet more people, ask questions, and learn from one another. And I think that's very promising.
That's good. Yeah, very well put. And for a little bit, I guess we'll be doing our getting out in the virtual space as we've done here tonight. So I hope that thank you to those of us who those of you who joined us tonight to listen in on this conversation, and we'll invite you to keep doing that. We've been doing the Books in Common series all through the summer, and we'll keep doing it through the fall and the winter. We have events coming up tomorrow with cookbook author Kate McDermott, and on Thursday with baseball and sports historians Eric Nussbaum and Rob Nair. One coming up next week with thriller writer John Grisham. So, you know, it's not all doom and gloom and an ultimate redemption. But mostly I'd like to thank you, Lonnie and Will, for taking part in this really stimulating conversation. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, James.
Thank you.
Thank you, Will.
All right. Well, again, thanks to everybody.